This Heart of a Shepherd is recorded for Sunday, April the 2nd, 2023. Now, the title of the devotional is Meats, that's the subject, Clean, Unclean, and Kosher. Our scripture reading, Leviticus chapter 17. Now, Leviticus 17 continued the Lord's instructions concerning sacrificial offerings as the tabernacle became the central place of worship. Now, this chapter mentions the importance of blood offerings for sin 13 times. Now, the Lord gave Moses explicit guidelines to teach, and I'm going to read chapter 17 and verse 1 and 2, to teach Aaron and unto his sons and unto all the children of Israel to follow. Now, remembering that the children of Israel were enslaved for 4 centuries, we understand how the people would have adopted Egypt's culture and religious practices, as according to verse 7. Now, the institution then of the commandments, laws, and guidelines for worship and sacrifices was not only the will of God, but it was necessary for the nation to be distinct in person and practice from the other nations. Now, notice with me then, Leviticus 17, verses 1 through 9, what I would describe as the centrality of sacrifices before the tabernacle. Now, Israel was to worship only Yahweh in his tabernacle, with his holy place and mercy seat being the only place for sacrifice in the future. Now, when Israel entered the promised land, the land would be divided by tribes. The requirement did change in Deuteronomy chapter 12. Now, to prevent sacrifices to other gods and to acknowledge the supply of their meat was from the Lord, all animals, including those that were for food, were to be slaughtered at the tabernacle. You read that, chapter 17, verses 2 through 7. Now, in this way, the Lord ensured he would receive the portion due him, the first fruits, and the priest would receive their portion for their household, verses 11 through 18. Now, notice with me Leviticus 17, verses 10 through 14, where we read the prohibition concerning ingesting or eating blood. Now, in verse 10, the blood of animals was not to be ingested in any manner. Now, the explanation for the prohibition of blood was stated clearly, chapter 17 and verse 1. The life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. It is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul. Now, what a powerful lesson in the matter of the blood. Now, millennial would pass before modern science and medicine established the importance of the blood to life. God already revealed it in his word, because Leviticus 17 and verse 11 tells us the life of the flesh is in the blood. And yet, as late as the 19th century, the practice of bloodletting, draining blood from someone who was ill, was practiced by doctors as a supposed cure. Now, if those doctors had read and believed the scriptures, they would have spared lives, knowing the life, that is the health of the flesh, is in the blood. Now, we have considered in an earlier devotion the distinction between clean meats, those that were allowed for human consumption, and unclean meats, those animals whose meat was prohibited. Now, you'll notice then that Leviticus 17 and verses 13 through 14 addressed the beasts taken in the hunt and their blood. Now, the blood of beast or fowl taken in the hunt was to be bled out on the ground. But notice too that even then the blood was to be covered with dust before the meat was consumed. Now, also verse 15, beasts that died of natural causes or had been torn by other beasts were not to be eaten. Now, understanding the danger of bacteria in meats, the Lord spared his people from ingested meats that presented unseen risk to their health and well-being. Now, should a man come in contact with such beast, in verse 15 we read, he was to wash his clothes, bathe himself in water, and be declared unclean until the evening. Then, we read, shall he be clean. Now, here's a closing thought for you and a brief look at what is known as the kosher diet. Now, consider with me as you go to a grocery store that you will find some meats that are labeled and some foods that are labeled kosher. Now, kosher describes a diet that conforms to the dietary laws that we have studied in the scriptures. In its simplicity, when meat, dairy, or other food is labeled kosher, it represents a stamp of approval for food that meets the biblical standard given by God. And so kosher meat must be a beast with cloven hoods and chews the cud. Cattle, lamb, goat, deer, for instance, but also be declared free of disease or cancers. Now, unfortunately, in our society, in this fast food era that we live in, there are many meats that are non-kosher and are produced for human consumption, and yet they are sometimes weak, sickly, diseased animals. Kosher also describes the method by which an animal is slaughtered. Far from the technique of mass butchering prevalent in today's meat processing plants, kosher animals are slaughtered humanely. And then finally, contrary to those who attack meat as a food source, the law of God permits meat consumption. Nevertheless, God is a loving creator, and his concern was not only for the health of humanity, but also for the well-being and humane treatment of the animals that we consume for food. So much more that might be said regarding kosher and the things that have been discovered regarding animals that are humanely killed versus the animals that are taken into a slaughterhouse, but we will have to leave that for another day. I thank you for following me, this heart of a shepherd, and I bid you a God bless day. Bye-bye.